Hansen was unfairly fired, and without money, he turned to his landlady, a mysterious blonde woman. She offered to forgive the rent if he agreed to take part in some strange prayer rituals with her. While they prayed, a neighbor, fed up with the noise, confronted them. Still, the landlady proposed that Hansen take over as caretaker of the building in exchange for a small salary. Though he hesitated, he eventually agreed. But now he had to deal with the angry neighbor, who despised him for selling out. Frustrated, Hansen decided to commit to his new role, even if not everyone was happy about it. Welcome back to another video, Manhwa lovers. Thanks for all the comments on the last one, especially to Cedric Shepherd 4459 for being the first to reply. Now let's continue. The story picks up inside a cafe, where the owner was scolding one of his employees for supposedly doing a poor job. This time, he accused him of throwing away something that could easily be reused with just a rinse. It was far too expensive to waste. The boss was tired of pointing these things out and blamed him for the shop's low sales, treating him like he was useless. But our protagonist knew his boss kept reusing leftovers and then complained about the lack of customers, which would inevitably lead to bankruptcy. For him, that bad practice was exactly why the business was sinking, so he wasn't worried about being fired. He knew he was telling the truth. In the end, he got fired anyway, even though he hadn't done anything wrong. He'd always been the kind of person who thinks before acting to avoid doing something he'd later regret. That's how he'd lived his life, holding back his temper to avoid regrets. Now he didn't even have enough money to pay rent. He checked his phone and saw his balance. Barely 150, a ridiculous amount compared to what he needed. And with his personality, there wasn't really anyone he could ask for help, until he found a certain name in his contacts. He realized he had only one option left: call his landlady. When the phone was answered, he introduced himself as Hansen, and they agreed to meet at their usual spot, in an apartment complex, inside one of the rooms. He was kneeling next to the blonde woman, his landlady. Still, Hansen looked exhausted. She told him that if he was that drained, he'd never reach a divine revelation, and asked if he wouldn't rather just accept the loan. She wanted him to do things properly, to help her, or else leave the apartment. Faced with that, the young man had no choice but to focus on the consecration. After giving her a light kiss, he began reading the Bible more quickly. Thanks to that, both of them were able to use the holy water to cleanse their hearts. Not long after, the landlady said she didn't like having to spell things out for him just to get a reaction, but since he'd managed to calm his corruption, she'd allow him to postpone the month's rent. Still, she asked why he never held on to a part-time job. She couldn't understand how he kept getting fired just for not turning a blind eye to reused food. However, she noticed that he stood by the truth, and that's why it was hard for him to stay silent. If it were her, she said, she'd have a hard time dealing with not being able to pay rent, having no money, and being forced to sell the pig. Hansen interrupted. He thought it was unfair not to be able to speak out when something was clearly wrong. Intrigued, the girl said he could say whatever he wanted, as long as it didn't get him fired again. But Hansen didn't care about corrupt businesses. He believed they deserved to be shut down. Hearing that, the landlady looked at him seriously. To her, he seemed like someone who didn't take responsibility for his actions. She saw him as a poor kid who couldn't even take care of his own life. She had no interest in listening to someone who couldn't support themselves. She made it clear: an adult who can't pay rent has no right to speak about justice while lounging around. She advised him to grow up and start acting his age. Then she asked, how long did he plan to keep being such a miserable little thing? Annoyed, Hans called her a boomer, saying she wasn't his mom and had no right to lecture him. In his mind, he didn't want to hear from someone who only needed him to fulfill her desires. But when the girl heard the word mom, she just smiled, a faint blush on her face. She told Hansen to get up. They had another prayer session to begin. She didn't understand what he was complaining about. Clearly, the chalice was glowing. Hansen thought they were already done, but to her, as long as someone could hear them, they could interpret it as him paying for the ceremony. So she wanted to decide when it ended, and she was in no rush. They had the whole night and he could go home in the morning. For Hansen, every time he was with his landlady, he felt that same strange sensation. Even if she didn't show it, she had a habit of meddling in his life. But since they were currently role-playing, he asked her to speak more kindly. Meanwhile, in another apartment, a girl was working on her computer. She muttered curses under her breath about her professor, convinced that the overwhelming workload was driving her insane. She couldn't understand how someone who had been on the school staff for years could know nothing about Excel, even though they claimed to be a programmer. But she was already planning her revenge once she graduated, determined to make that professor's life anything but easy. Lost in her thoughts, she suddenly heard noises coming from the floor above, and instantly knew they were holding another consecration ceremony. Meanwhile, Hansen continued praying alongside Joan, although he was a bit concerned about her. The blonde, however, just wanted him to stay quiet. Still, the boy assured her that his faith grew stronger when he prayed for a little puppy's well-being, asking if that counted as a special kind of prayer. But Guyon expected him to already know the answer and reminded him that instead of getting distracted, they should focus on their duty. So the boy kept reading the Bible without pause. Back in her apartment, the other girl cursed the two, holding the prayer session in silence. She thought they must have way too much free time if they were praying at that hour, and she couldn't stand listening to them anymore. Fed up, she got out of her chair and stormed upstairs. When she reached their door, she began ringing the bell nonstop, shouting that she was the neighbor from downstairs and that they were being too loud. Despite her persistence, Hansen wasn't particularly alarmed. He figured maybe they shouldn't have prayed so close to the wall. Young, on the other hand, chose to ignore her, thinking of her as just a bitter tenant who always complained about everything. Still, the constant ringing began to irritate Hansen, so he decided to go talk to her before returning. However, Young stopped him, reminding him that their priority was to help her reach her divine revelation and that he needed to obey her. The boy simply nodded and continued with the prayers, which only enraged the neighbor even more. When the ceremony finally ended, Hansen decided to go out and see what she wanted. But the blonde didn't understand why he was bothering. After all, she owned the place. Hansen understood her point, but couldn't deny that in this story, they weren't exactly the good guys. Hearing that, Young was left speechless. When Hansel opened the door to apologize for the delay, he noticed something strange. A note was stuck on the door, complaining about the noise. Upon reading it, he realized the neighbor had already complained before and was now demanding they stop the ceremonies. But the most unsettling part was that it wasn't just one note. Looking around, he saw several more posted along the hallway. He couldn't figure out what was going on. How many had she put up? How had she done it so quickly? Shocked, he started walking around and discovered they were even posted on the stairwell walls. That's when he realized it would take him quite a while to remove them all. Just then, the landlady stepped out and, seeing what he was doing, asked why he was bothering to take them down. She was honestly surprised that the neighbor had gone so far. She already knew someone in the building was particularly sensitive to noise, but it seemed like today she had completely lost her mind. Then she turned to Hansel, curious to hear his opinion. Not quite sure what she meant, he waited for her explanation. Hyon then asked if he didn't find it unfair that someone demanded they stop when all they were doing was solving the rent issue. She reminded him that they were on her property. Did they really need to obey just because someone else told them to? She had bought the whole complex with her own money, so she didn't see why she should care about other people's opinions. Hans, for his part, just wanted them to put the chalice away, at least while they were outside. But before he could say anything else, Kion surprised him with a kiss. Then she told him she had been thinking. She believed he should be the one in charge of the building. She felt like she was starting to get sick from handling everything alone, and from what she saw, Hansel would probably do well if he started getting involved in these matters. So she offered to pay him 4,000 good coins a month, along with letting him help purify her heart, just like they had done that day. Although Hansel didn't fully understand her words, he wasn't someone who could be bought so easily. It sounded to her like she was offering him money and a home, exactly what he needed. She figured he was probably tired of arguing with people, and if he agreed to become her nighttime partner whenever she requested it, she'd pay for everything. He could do whatever he wanted, as long as he fulfilled his part. She hoped it was a good deal, but if he didn't think so, he could simply forget about it. Hansel asked for a moment to think it over. In his mind, he didn't know what to decide. Accepting would make him feel like some kind of servant. Still, he said that since he liked doing things the proper way, they should continue their prayers right there while he considered the offer. Just as he was about to begin praying again, Hansel ended up accepting the proposal. She jokingly welcomed him as her dear unemployed son, though neither of them realized that the nosy neighbor had heard everything. So much so, she couldn't understand why the manager had handed over the building to such an irresponsible guy. As the ceremony continued, Hai felt a deep sense of peace in her heart, knowing that Hansel was purifying his darkest sins. However, at one point, the boy began reading the Bible faster, stumbled, and ended up spilling the holy water. Gion noticed immediately and, with a serious look, asked why he had thrown it. Now it was all over the floor. Hans, on the other hand, felt they had already cleansed their souls and figured it wasn't necessary this time. To the blonde, his way of thinking was rather strange, but she told him to clean it up immediately. She didn't want the smell to spread all over, and if he planned to keep living there without paying rent, she strongly advised him to do things her way. Hansel just sighed, but when he saw how far the water had spread, He cursed under his breath. It had gone too far, and although he thought spilling it had been a mistake, he was annoyed that he now had to rush to clean it up. Just then, he noticed the lights in the hallway downstairs were off. He thought the sensor might be broken, but when they finally flickered on, he was relieved to confirm it wasn't a wiring issue. However, that relief didn't last long. He saw the annoying neighbor sitting there, clearly embarrassed. Hansel stared at her, and she stared back. When he tried to say something, the girl bolted and ran back into her apartment. He just stood there, thinking how frustrating it all was. Meanwhile, inside her apartment, the neighbor was trying to catch her breath after running. The moment she locked eyes with that scoundrel was still fresh in her mind. All she had wanted was for the owner to see her frustration, but now she found herself questioning everything. Was it really okay to hold a consecration ceremony in the hallway? It was hard for her to believe. She even wondered if the guy was some kind of weirdo who enjoyed letting people know he was holding rituals out in the open. Still, she couldn't ignore the chalice he had been carrying. Something inside her began to shift, and she ended up cursing the whole situation. Elsewhere, Hansen asked Jian why she wanted him to take over. She was still caught up in her role play, which didn't bother him, but he wanted to know her real reason. She replied that she brought him there because he was good at ceremonies, but Hansel suspected there was more to it. He paused and commented that the condo seemed hard to manage, with residents always causing problems. He wasn't sure if she was talking about the girl he'd seen the night before. After all, she had probably heard everything. The blonde continued, saying she'd heard there was someone in the building that all the tenants constantly complained about. From now on, she wanted him to handle that situation. For her, helping an unemployed person while holding soothing rituals was what she called mutual dependence. Hansel, however, wanted to know why it was such a problem if tenants complained often about someone. The blonde spoke plainly. He had seen it for himself. He knew that girl was the kind of person who, the moment something bothered her, took things way too far. And this wasn't the first time she'd acted like that. She had already crossed the line into hysteria. There was no reason to worry about her, at least not as long as she wasn't standing right in front of him. Still, just in case, it was better to keep his body in shape. With that, she said goodbye. Hans didn't fully understand what she meant, but as long as he did what he had to, there wouldn't be a problem. As they headed toward the parking lot, she reminded him of the terms he needed to fulfill to get paid. Hansel knew the deal. He would have to work hard to earn his paycheck. The blonde congratulated him, adding that he only needed to work on his facial expressions a bit and hoped she wouldn't regret placing her trust in him. Still, even if he tried to stay calm, he was the kind of person who didn't shy away from complaints, especially because the ceremonies were happening in the hallways. In a way, he could understand why someone would be upset. If he were in that person's shoes, he probably would have been annoyed too. He wondered what a good building manager would do in that kind of situation. Either way, he didn't want to dwell on it. As soon as he could, he'd take down the handwritten posters. But just as he was about to start, he saw her on the stairs. His face lit up instantly, and to his surprise, the girl blushed as well when she saw him. He hadn't expected to run into her so soon, but still, he greeted her. He asked if she had been the one ringing the bell the night before. He explained that if it had been too noisy, it was due to certain circumstances, but he would be more careful not to cause any more problems. She frowned, not really understanding what he meant by circumstances. Hans felt a bit guilty, though in his mind, he knew perfectly well that her expression showed nothing but disbelief. Then, noticing the papers in her hands, he asked if she was planning to take them down herself. If not, he'd do it. He asked her to hand over the ones she had already removed so he could get rid of them. But instead of responding, she just stared at him with a mix of irritation and embarrassment. Hansel insisted, asking if she had heard him, but the girl seemed more focused on the rapid beating of her own heart. Finally, she replied that she didn't need help, especially not from someone like him. Hansel didn't understand what she meant until she accused him of not even asking why she had put up the posters in the first place. She made it clear. It was because people like him and the landlady were making way too much noise without caring about others. And it wasn't just any noise. It was loud, over-the-top praise, the kind that couldn't even be described. She wouldn't let someone like him help her. If he didn't know already, there were rumors going around that he was just a sellout who followed orders like a dog for a bit of cash. On top of that, someone who acted so high and mighty couldn't be considered a real man. At best, just another nobody. Hansel felt frustration building inside. In his mind, he realized this was exactly why he rarely bothered to apologize. People started feeling superior and spouting nonsense. Did she really think she was above him just because she stuck a few posters on the wall? Now, more than ever, he saw her as unhinged, which only made it worse. But just as he was about to throw back a remark, He remembered his money problems and Gion's warning. Do your job if you want to get paid. It wasn't worth arguing any longer. The best thing to do was walk away. So, without another word, he told the girl he was leaving and left her to her business. Before going, he suggested that next time, she find the courage to say things to his face instead of acting like a lunatic. From that day forward, he'd be managing the building and would later post his contact information on the wall. Still, the girl just watched him walk away, unable to look away from the handsome figure retreating down the hall. She tried to seem indifferent, but the image of Hansel leaving wouldn't leave her mind. She cursed her own behavior, feeling trapped in an awkward situation. Finally, she called out to him, asking him to stop. Hans turned around, intrigued. Without meeting his eyes, she held out the papers in her hands and asked him to help throw them away. She admitted she had put up way too many all over the building and didn't even know what she had been thinking. She apologized for what she'd said earlier, including the messages written on the posters, saying it had all been a spur-of-the-moment decision. She promised she'd take care of removing them herself. She just hoped he could get rid of those. Hans felt for her, though in his mind, he couldn't stop wondering why her attitude had suddenly changed. Now that he thought about it, she looked cuter than before, but he wasn't sure whether he should be kind to her. Hansel told the girl she could reach out to him if she ever had a problem, but she stayed silent, blushing slightly at his words. Before he could leave, she hesitated, then finally worked up the courage to ask, how much would she have to pay for a consecration with him? The question echoed in Hansel's mind. He stared at her, stunned, unsure how to respond. The girl didn't know what she had done wrong, but he made it clear. He wasn't that kind of person, and the question felt insulting. He figured she asked because of what she had seen the previous day, the conversation with the landlady about money and the ritual they had performed. But for her to bring it up so bluntly only annoyed him more. He wondered if she was always like this, just saying whatever popped into her head without thinking about the consequences. He chose to ignore it, pretending he hadn't heard anything, and said goodbye. Zin was left alone, wondering if she shouldn't have said that. In her eyes, Hansel was still just a nobody, no matter how much he denied it. Later on, Hyon noticed Hansel was in a worse mood than he had been that morning. When she asked what was wrong, he mentioned that he'd run into the girl from apartment 301. Just thinking about having to keep seeing her gave him a headache. The encounter had been brief, so he couldn't say what kind of relationship they might have going forward. Jay found it odd that he hadn't realized something yet, but Hansel didn't understand her comment. She simply meant, did he want to have a consecration with Zumbing or not? For Hansel, it was a meaningless topic, but for Hyon, it meant something. After all, that was the reason she had hired him in the first place. He didn't even consider doing it, convinced that Zumbing just said things without thinking. To Jay, Hansel's attitude was amusing, and she asked if the girl's appearance was the issue. Hans didn't understand why she kept pushing that topic, but he made it clear. Girls like Zumbing weren't his type. To him, it was obvious. He'd always preferred sweet, innocent girls with long, straight hair. You only had to look at his photo gallery, filled with celebrities who all looked exactly the same. Still, she remained curious about his foul mood. Hans, not wanting to get into the details, said that if he told her everything, she'd just get mad. That only made the blonde even more curious, and she insisted on knowing. For her, making a good impression was important, especially if he wanted to make money. That's when she noticed Hansel's chalice seemed like it wanted to say something. He went silent for a moment. In his mind, he knew very well they were back at it, preparing for another ceremony. Deep down, he was aware that his relationship with Yang was nothing more than that, a bond centered around the rituals. Being a tenant and the building's manager was just a cover. In fact, someone like him, who couldn't even take responsibility for his own life, should be grateful that his connection with Yang still existed. Even so, Zumbing's words kept echoing in his head. He'd been upset when she called him a nobody, but honestly, his current situation contradicted that anger. Those gloomy thoughts weighed heavily on him. Eventually, he decided to tell Yang what had happened. He explained that he had run into Zumbing on the stairs after cleaning the hallway. He saw her taking down the posters and thought about helping her, but something clearly bothered her, and she suddenly acted rudely. Ju asked if that was all, and Hansel lied, saying yes. He knew Zbin was the type to lash out no matter what you said. It was obvious she spent too much time online, and he wasn't wrong. Zbin had anonymously posted about the incident, asking for opinions from others. At first, she received comments from people in similar situations, but some pointed out her mistake. Though it annoyed her, she ended up admitting she was in the wrong, something she already sensed deep down, especially since Hansel was kind of her type. Suddenly, and without meaning to, she felt like a girl with a crush. Before she realized it, she left a comment related to religion. Zumbing started scolding herself for what she'd done, calling herself crazy over and over. She kept wondering what she'd do if she ran into him again, now that the initial embarrassment had passed a little. To her, the solution was to move out, but she had nowhere to go. Frustrated, she threw her pillow across the room, cursing her own stupidity. In the end, she decided that the best thing was to apologize first. Sitting in silence wouldn't solve anything, but she also didn't know exactly what to say. A simple, "Sorry, I said something harsh without knowing anything," didn't seem like enough, or the right thing to say to someone she had only met once. She tried rewriting it in her mind, but if she was being honest, she still thought he was a bit of a nobody. Yet she didn't want to talk like it was all her fault either, because he wasn't entirely innocent. The whole thing made her angry. None of this would have happened if they hadn't been so loud to begin with. If her situation were different, she wouldn't have to be dealing with this at all. Meanwhile, Gion was cleaning the chalice and told Hansel they could do the prayer session there. But he preferred the room next door. He didn't want to bother the neighbors downstairs again. She didn't think it was a big deal, but for Hansel, it was important. Now he was the building manager, or at least he had to act like one. Hyun gave him a playful look and asked if he was trying to protect his image just to impress a girl who, after a single encounter, seemed to have strengthened her faith. Hansel quickly insisted that wasn't the case, but Hyun noticed something odd. The chalice was glowing more than usual, even before he had taken it out of its case. Hansel tried to brush it off, saying that could happen to anyone. To shift the topic, he made a comment about the blonde's rather strong feelings, hoping she wouldn't dress like that anymore. Considering how she acted like she lived alone, he had nowhere else to look. Hyun teased him, asking what she was supposed to do with thoughts like his. Hans realized she was still playing the overprotective mom act. Though she wasn't sure if it was still just a game, she fed him a piece of bread directly into his mouth, thinking that if she fed him like that, maybe he'd stop asking questions. She knew that, deep down, Hans still depended on her in many ways. To make her point, she jokingly called him son, but then asked, half serious, if it would be okay to go into the other room to pray. While they were in the middle of their prayers, Zumin was outside, about to ring the doorbell. She knew the landlady was home, but noticed the door was slightly open. She wondered if they were actually holding a ceremony with the door left open. At that moment, Hansel was listening to the Bible reading and noticed that Gion seemed unusually loud that day. He mentioned it, but she told him it was just his imagination. Still, the expression on her face looked embarrassed. If Zumin happened to hear something, she would have to be pressed right up against the door, which in fact she was doing at that very moment. Hai kept talking, wondering what Zumbing would say this time if she happened to hear something. Maybe she'd put up another poster that read, "I'm jealous of Unit 401, so no more prayer sessions." Besides that, there wasn't much else she could do. To her, Zumbing was only capable of writing odd posts online or complaining in passive-aggressive ways. So she asked Hansel to stop worrying and focus on doing his job properly, hoping he would understand. From the other side of the door, Zumbing had heard every word. She felt her blood boiling. Why did she have to listen to those lunatics praying every single day? Unable to contain her frustration, she slammed the door shut. In her mind, a painful memory resurfaced. She remembered a couple mocking her, calling her silly despite her looks and good figure. The girl in that couple had given her a harsh piece of advice. With such a negative personality, no guy would ever pay attention to her. Still, Zbin was convinced that Gion had bought Hansel like some disposable servant, and now she was just showing off, bragging about holding prayer sessions with him. Like it was something anyone couldn't do if they just paid. No matter how much it cost, if she had to, she'd get Hans too, whatever it took. But then she heard quick footsteps. Suddenly, the door swung open, and there stood Hansel, clearly eager to catch whoever had been spying on them. To his surprise, it was Zumbing. Embarrassed, she couldn't help but stare at the glowing chalice, wondering if it could actually help her pray. Hansel, however, seemed confused by her strange comparison. When he mentioned her apartment number and asked what she was doing there, Summon panicked and ran. In her mind, she cursed herself again and again. She had to get home immediately. But just as she turned, she felt someone grab her arm. It was Hansel, looking annoyed. He asked why she had been banging on the door, what she was doing standing there, or whether she had been peeking inside. Zumbing, visibly nervous, couldn't find the words to explain. Hans just thought he needed to talk to her, but didn't understand why she looked so agitated. Still, Guyon shouted from behind, telling him to go get changed before going out or coming back. Hansel understood and walked off for a moment, but he couldn't figure out why it was so hard for Zumbing to just say something. He hoped she'd drop the strange act and speak directly if she had something to say. After all, he wouldn't let her run off again without talking. Meanwhile, Zumbing kept thinking about what had happened, about Hansel's grip on her arm. She wondered if Guy's hands were always that big and strong, or if her landlady had always been guided down the path of God by those very hands. When Hansel returned, Yan asked if he really planned to go out dressed like that. He replied that he had no choice. The door had slammed shut, and it could have been anyone. Then he asked the blonde why it had been open to begin with. Hen thought for a moment and figured someone had forgotten to close it properly. Probably the girl from apartment 301. Then she asked Hansel what it felt like to catch the culprit in the act. Though the word culprit felt a bit extreme to him, he couldn't help but notice that Zbin hadn't said a single word when he confronted her. It was like she had become someone else entirely. He wasn't sure why, but in a strange way, he felt a sense of relief on both sides. Still, as the building's manager, it did concern him that she was wandering around. To Jiang, however, it was great to see him taking responsibility and voicing his concerns. After all, the title of manager was just a label. She hadn't chosen him because he was perfect for the job. She simply wanted someone close by to share her little hobby with. But she wouldn't stop him if he wanted to take it seriously. To her, the title Good Son sounded better anyway, hoping he'd agree. Hans, however, didn't give it much thought, so Guion suggested they take a bath and head to bed. After all, they had a free day tomorrow. Meanwhile, somewhere else, Zumbing was playing the guitar alone. She was so focused on the melody that she accidentally knocked over a glass of holy water. Just then, Hansel appeared, ready to guide her down God's path. Zumbing blushed at the situation, but suddenly, a danger alert appeared in her mind. She didn't have enough data to continue the mental simulation she'd prepared. Zumbing already knew that, and cursed herself. She couldn't even picture herself holding a consecration. But she understood clearly that this had all been part of Gion's plan. After all, she had left the door slightly open on purpose to provoke a reaction, and it had worked. The next morning, Gion was on the phone. It seemed someone had broken a promise, changing things to suit their own convenience. That same person had assured her they would respect her decisions while she was working. Still, she could only blame herself for trusting her father, wishing that from now on he'd stop making empty promises. When she hung up, she noticed Hans was already awake, fairly early. He asked if they were still going out for lunch, but she replied that the plan was canceled because she'd be gone for a few days. She asked him to take care of the place while she was away. When Hansel asked why, Gion explained it was work-related. She'd been pressured into going, with no option to refuse. It was urgent, and she needed help picking out clothes. Even though she had told him the day before, she preferred to repeat it once more. She hoped he'd stay calm, not cause any trouble, and just keep quiet. She'd be back as soon as the assignment was over. Once Hyan left, Hansel was left thinking about what she meant by not causing trouble and keeping quiet. He wasn't a child who needed to be disciplined, although maybe she saw him that way, given how often she spoke to him like that. Still, he understood that all she asked was that he follow instructions, and that made his job simple, stable, with few responsibilities. Having someone like her so close felt like a blessing, especially since he was always getting fired from his part-time jobs for speaking his mind when something bothered him. He had been living like that for a while, and maybe he was already tired of it. Being told not to cause problems or speak up didn't sound so bad anymore, but he wondered if he could really live that way. At that moment, he heard Zumbing calling him. It caught his attention. For her, being there was just a coincidence. She was simply going down the stairs to head to the supermarket. But Hansel noticed she was clearly avoiding talking about what happened the night before. He wasn't planning to let it slide. He wanted to know why she had been eavesdropping and what she had intended to tell him. He reminded her that this time, he wouldn't let her walk away without an answer. Zumbing grew visibly nervous, but asked if they could talk about it inside her apartment, leaving Hansel speechless. Shortly after entering her place, Hansel started looking around. Now he understood what the other units in the building were like. He had to admit, it was more spacious than Unit 401 where he stayed. Although both were bigger than the places he'd lived in before, he was surprised by how organized everything was. At first, he'd imagined it would be a mess, like those rooms of people who spend all day watching anime or reading manga online. But it was the opposite. However, something caught his eye, a plastic bag sticking out from under the sink. He wondered why the trash was there, since it could start to smell. Just then, Zumbing spoke up and asked if he'd like to sit down. Hansel didn't mind standing, but she warned that the conversation might be long and hoped he'd make himself comfortable. Hans tried to understand what she meant by that. He was honest. He didn't think it was necessary if all she wanted to do was apologize. All he wanted was to get the matter over with. But Zumbing, nervous, clearly wanted to say something more. To Hansel, that just meant she would end up apologizing anyway, so she might as well start there. If she promised not to spy outside someone's door again, that would be enough. Though Zumbing said nothing at first, she eventually admitted her mistake and apologized. For Hansel, that was a good first step. They were heading in the right direction. So he asked her what she actually wanted to say. He warned her that if she asked something like she had the first time, he'd leave without hesitation. He wasn't joking. Zumbing was clearly uneasy, trying to find the right words. She finally confessed that last time, she had been harsh and said inappropriate things. Deep down, she felt like she wanted to be close to him. Not in a creepy or over-the-top way. She just wanted to pray one night beside him. What she truly wanted to ask was very specific. What kind of relationship did he have with the landlady? Hansel had been wondering the same thing himself. In his mind, he remembered that years ago she had found him during a difficult time. Back then, he had told her his story, how he had stormed out of his house with no one to turn to. He had been fired from every part-time job and had no money. Even so, he walked from agency to agency, looking for a decent place to live. Hyon had recognized him as the clumsy little brother everyone said would end up on the streets sooner or later. Hansel didn't like being seen that way, but it was true. His situation was pretty rough. Without sugarcoating it, he told Yang that he didn't care what her sister had said about him. He just wanted to know if they had any room available. Yang did have a few units, but she doubted they'd meet the boys' expectations. However, for Hansel, that wasn't an issue. He wasn't asking for anything fancy, just a place with internet and hot water. He questioned the girl, wondering if she was incapable of renting out a nice, expensive room. But Yang didn't rent based on luxury. She rented based on someone's level. No landlord would rent a room without certain guarantees. How could she be sure he'd pay the rent? She already knew he had been looking for places, especially near the station, areas that were incredibly nice and hard to get for someone in his situation. Still, it just so happened she had a room available right in the area he was searching for, and the fact that her friend's little brother had had the nerve to come looking for her in a place like that made her curious. But there was something else she cared about more. If he agreed to a personal request, she'd overlook his lack of financial security. Hansel didn't fully understand what she meant, but Gion didn't seem willing to go into detail either. She just asked him to remember one thing. From now on, there would be moments when she needed him urgently, and he wouldn't be allowed to refuse. He'd have to show up immediately when she called. Hans didn't get what she intended to do with him, but Jan simply said she needed company. There were times when she got anxious being alone. If he agreed to that, he could live in a room right across from the station. And that's how they met, and how they started living under the same roof. In the present, Hansel looked away from Zumbi and calmly replied that there was nothing between them. To him, Hem was simply his boss, one who spent most of her time away from home, and he was just the janitor who looked after the building while she was gone. Zumbin asked why he looked away, and, pretending not to care, she sniffed at her own neck and said she'd slept badly. But in her mind, she was cursing the situation. Even though Hansel and Hyon weren't in a relationship, he still insisted he wasn't just some nobody. That didn't matter now. She couldn't help but imagine them as a couple, or at least that's what his words implied. Trying to be more direct, Zumbin asked Hansel if they were close enough to perform a consecration in the hallway. He admitted he had known the landlady for a while, though he didn't think even she would consider them close. And he made it clear that it wasn't Zumbin's business. After all, a consecration didn't require a romantic relationship. She agreed, but in her mind she kept wondering if it was really true that closeness wasn't necessary. Though she didn't understand their eccentricities, she began to doubt whether everyone thought the same, or if she was the only one with a different mindset. That made Hansen give her a cold, indifferent look. He realized she must have had a pretty carefree life. Then he asked if that was all she wanted to say, since the conversation didn't really concern her. If there was nothing else, he would leave. But Zumin asked him to wait. She didn't understand why he suddenly seemed upset, or why everything felt so different from the stories she read online. Wasn't he supposed to fall for her charm the moment she appeared vulnerable? She began to wonder if things were ever that easy, even for someone as attractive as her. Still flustered, she asked Hansel to give her one more minute, because she had one last question. If he wasn't dating anyone and could perform a consecration with just anyone, no need for closeness, then would it be a problem to do it with someone he was just getting to know? That's what she wanted to ask. Or, more specifically, She was curious to know if the building manager could perform a ceremony with one of the tenants. She quickly added not to get the wrong idea. She was only asking out of curiosity. Though she admitted the question could be misinterpreted, she insisted she only asked because he was the one in charge of the building. Hearing this, Hansel figured she was expecting an immediate answer. Shortly after, we see Zumbin wondering how it was even possible that Hansel had sent her to change clothes for the ritual in such a short time. While he complimented her unmatched beauty, he could tell that her looks were mostly genetic. Still, he decided to share his thoughts with her later, after he had helped cleanse her soul. However, she didn't want things to move too fast. At that moment, Hans started looking for the bread Zbin had been hiding. Once again, he praised her, this time for how beautiful and large they had turned out. He couldn't wait to try them. But at that moment, he also began performing a jutsu to calm Zumbing's corruption, something she hadn't planned and which happened surprisingly quickly. To Hansel, Zumb looked adorable while flustered. He asked if she was nervous since he was showing her what had sparked so much curiosity in her. As he continued the jutsu, he could tell it was working, although she responded by scratching him. He didn't understand what her problem was but decided to ignore it and keep searching for peace through the guitar. He reminded her that everything he was doing was for her sake, and she only needed to relax and embrace the serenity. He had already released a good part of the corruption in her heart and was sure they were on the right track. Now, what mattered was that both of them found the path to the Lord. Still confused, Zumbing asked him to wait. Hans, without hesitation, asked her if she was truly interested or just pretending. She could choose to continue or stop right then and there. He didn't understand why. After seeming so sure at first, she was now hesitating. But she wasn't focused on the question. Her eyes were locked on the chalice, which was glowing even more than she had imagined. Hans brought her back to the moment by insisting on an answer. Zumbing admitted she never thought the mass would happen so fast, something Hans understood. Then his eyes landed on a small box she had tucked inside her waistband. Zumbing tried to cover it up with a nervous laugh, saying she had no idea how it got there. But Hansel wasn't about to let it slide. He wanted her to stop pretending she didn't know anything. He didn't understand why she insisted on acting so noble and pure when they had already come this far. Was she regretting it, or just embarrassed? Zumbin firmly denied both. To him, that meant he could proceed with the preparations. Now that he had the rosary in hand, it was time to begin the prayers. Zumbing tried to stop him, but as soon as he spoke the first line, she was stunned. She wondered why he had paused halfway through the passage. Hans explained that he had just made a small pause before continuing with the Bible reading. He wanted to know how she was doing, but in her mind, she was more focused on the fact that they hadn't finished yet. Hans continued reading without stopping, convinced it was the best way to bring her peace. Although he had no real idea what kind of person Zumbing truly was, one thing was clear. She was exactly his type. He grabbed a couple of the breads and began playing with them, which caused Zumbin to scold him. To him, it was just part of guiding her through the consecration. Zumbing, still overwhelmed, had never imagined her soul would ache so much. But Hans knew her heart was trying to say something else. He discovered her weak spot in a few gummy buttons and decided to play with them a little, despite Zumbim's embarrassment. To him, it only meant she was on the right path to the Lord. In fact, he was just about to fetch some holy water, since her heart was still impure. He continued his prayers as usual, convinced that at least his soul was honest. When he finally used the holy water together with the rosary, he realized he'd used much more than expected. He wondered if yesterday's consecration hadn't been enough, although he felt there was something more behind it. Hansel acknowledged it had been a revitalizing ceremony. It had been a long time since he'd experienced such a peaceful mass. Zumbing, though usually arrogant, was now unconscious. That gave him a strange feeling of superiority. As he watched her, he commented that he was starting to enjoy the ceremony and asked if she would like to continue. Zumbin, unsure of what was happening, was left speechless. To him, she had a natural gift for making him feel calm, which only confirmed further that she was his type. He saw no problem in continuing. In fact, he hoped she would realize they would keep praying until they found peace. They still had a long road ahead, so he began a new prayer, this time for the well-being of a little puppy. Zumbin, not knowing how to react, just stared at him in complete silence. In a nearby apartment, a girl woke up from the commotion, wondering what all the noise was and why there was clapping coming from the room next door. Meanwhile, Hanel and Zumin continued with their prayers. To him, her reactions were adorable. Even if she didn't want him to hear them, he intended to take it all the way. Out of curiosity, he asked where she had learned to be so cute. Zumbing didn't understand the question, but Hansel really meant to ask who had taught her to pray like that, as if encouraging him to continue the ceremony. Her blushing made him realize it didn't matter if she didn't answer. He would keep reading the Bible until the chalice dimmed. To his surprise, Zoman admitted no one had ever taught her anything. That intrigued Hansel. She repeated her words, asking if he really thought she was pretending. Every time she heard him read a verse, she felt like her lungs were being crushed. Hansel was left speechless. Her confession drove him crazy. All he could do was acknowledge that the chalice glowed too brightly with her. To him, that meant he could guide her through the Lord's word without training. Her soul seemed born with a gift for consecration. Zumbing flatly denied it, asking what he was even talking about. But Hansel, seeing how devout she looked, wondered if she'd just been faking innocence. He hoped she would be honest so they could enjoy the ceremony better. But she insisted it wasn't like that. Thinking it over, Hans asked what was wrong with seeing her so devoted, though maybe that was why the ceremony seemed boring to her. Suddenly he apologized, saying he needed to go fetch more holy water. After revitalizing Zumbin's soul, he felt a deep relief, as if it had been his very first consecration. Seeing her condition, he asked if she was okay. He knew she had fainted a little from exhaustion, though they hadn't done that much. He wouldn't try to continue if she was in that state, though inside he still didn't feel satisfied. Zumbing, completely drained, felt like she couldn't go on. To her, it felt like she was dying, and she couldn't understand how he still had energy. Hans reminded her that she was the one who had wanted to start the ceremony in the first place, and he was the one who had done all the work, while she ended up tired. Zumbing, exasperated, shouted that she also had the right to complain, and that her soul felt completely numb. To Hansel, she was whining like someone who had just lost their purity of heart, which only made her angrier. Annoyed, she asked if being a religious maniac was something to be proud of. Hansel, far from offended, blushed and reflected on it. He asked her if it had really been her first Mass, because her prayers didn't seem like it. Seeing how naturally she accepted everything that had happened, he figured she must have had some experience. When he tried to dig deeper, Suan reacted by kicking him. She didn't understand why he made her seem like the perverted one, though Hansel himself didn't realize how he had made her feel that way. To her, his words made it sound like she was the problem. She grabbed a pillow and threw it at him with force, but it ended up flying into the kitchen sink. Alarmed, she looked over to where it had landed. Among the fallen items, several trash bags were revealed. Hans wondered what all that was. Counting them, there were about 10, which he found unbelievable. He couldn't understand how someone could accumulate that much garbage in one place. Zumbing, nervous, was trembling, unsure what to say. When Hans asked if she didn't clean, she didn't know how to answer. She made an excuse, saying she was busy with her at-home work, which took up all her time, and even if he was the manager, she paid rent, so she didn't see why he should interfere in things like that. Hansel walked over to inspect the sink and found mold growing in the pipes. Immediately, he knew it was a health hazard if she ever drank water from there. However, he still wanted to understand what he'd heard earlier, so he asked Suman if he could step in on something like this. His tone worried her. After a moment, Hansel gave her some life advice. He explained that mold traveled at light speed, and if left unchecked, could spread into the walls, hallways, and even other apartments. He asked how busy she could really be if she couldn't clean her apartment at least once. If he hadn't discovered it, things would have gotten much worse. Though Hansel was usually fair with untidy people, Zumbing's case was extreme. Still angry, Zumbing asked if he really cleaned all the time. After all, he had somehow managed to pick up all the trash already. For Hansel, it all meant that Suman had just kept putting off cleaning until it got out of hand. Still, he told her to follow him so they could take all the bags out. Zombie didn't understand why he was helping. After all, she was the one living there. Hansel reminded her that he was the building manager. Even if she saw him as just a nobody, he was doing this so she'd acknowledge his role. He asked if that sounded fair. But just then, the doorbell rang. Hansen looked at her curiously and asked if she was expecting someone. Zom shook her head, but he insisted she open the door since they needed to leave. When she did, she found Sasha standing there. Disappointed, Sasha said she had just woken up and didn't know what to do. She explained she had to head to her part-time job and was busy that day, so she didn't have time to rest. She also reminded Zumbin to be quiet during the day and asked what she'd been doing to make so much noise. Hans observed the newcomer with interest. Something about her made him think she was foreign. However, before he could say anything, Sasha noticed his presence and asked Zumbin if he was her ex. Zumbing, shocked, immediately denied it. Sasha, intrigued, said she asked because from what she heard earlier, it had sounded like they were having some sort of ceremony. Not wasting the opportunity, She looked at Hansel with a smile and said he was quite handsome. With a curious glint, she asked again if he really wasn't Zumbin's ex, adding that she wanted to know what he thought of her. Without warning, she directly asked Hansel if he wanted her to be his wife.